Welcome, my soft-thinking listener. You've found yourself in the company of the Sleepy Sloth once again. A slow, scientifically minded fellow, who enjoys facts, instruments, and things that make quiet sounds when they are not being played. I must tell you something before we begin. Today, I consider myself a scientist in obsolete musical instruments. A scientist wannabe who is almost always correct, except for those few times when I am not. But even then, I prefer to drift gently onward, rather than fuss over it. Because what truly matters is the information itself. Before I start, please, let me know. What is the most boring thing you would secretly love hearing about? Let me know gently, in the comments. Now, let us begin today's episode of Obsolete Instruments, beginning with some of the oldest known to humankind. The Lyre of Ur from around 3000 BC, is not something most people will think about when closing their eyes at night. And yet, it is a quiet companion of history. This instrument, discovered in the ancient city of Ur in Mesopotamia, belonged not to common folk, but to royalty, and to those who believed music could act as a bridge between mortals and the divine. Imagine, if you will, a small wooden frame shaped almost like a rectangle with arms rising gently upward. Stretched across this frame were strings made of twisted animal gut, each requiring patient preparation, drying, and tensioning to achieve a tone. The sound it produced was soft, fragile, and likely faint to our modern ears. Scholars believe it accompanied songs for rituals, ceremonies, and possibly funerals, its tones drifting like delicate threads of air in palace halls. One might wonder how many times the strings snapped, or how carefully a player had to tune by ear, adjusting wooden pegs with a twist so small that it must have required absolute stillness of hand. No one asked for this detail, and yet, here we are, letting the silence of an ancient lyre hum in our imagination. And if we linger a little longer, we notice the decoration: gold leaf, inlaid lapis lazuli, and carved bulls' heads adorning some of the surviving lyres from Ur's royal tombs, delicate symbols of strength and fertility resting atop fragile strings. The lyre's survival into myth and story suggests that even when the wood decayed, the idea of its voice was never truly lost, whispering across the centuries as a reminder of how even the faintest tones can leave their trace. Now, let us float, ever so slowly, to Egypt, around 2800 BC. Here we encounter the sistrum, a sacred rattle-like instrument that few outside of specialists have heard of, and fewer still have ever seen. The sistrum is not much more than a metal frame, often U-shaped or rectangular, with thin rods stretched across. On these rods rested loose discs or rings that would jingle when shaken. And though this description may sound simple, in Egypt it was never merely a toy. It was an offering of sound to the goddess Hathor, who was believed to bring joy, fertility, and the sweetness of life. The sound of the sistrum was meant to mimic the rustling of papyrus reeds in the wind, or perhaps the gentle stirrings of nature itself. Imagine a priestess standing in a temple, lifting this small instrument, and shaking it gently. The metallic discs clattered softly, a sound both sharp and delicate, echoing against stone walls. In ritual, it was believed the noise could frighten away ill-meaning spirits, or soothe the ear of the divine. Today, we think of rattles as small, almost trivial things. But here, the sistrum was weighty with symbolic importance. The very handle was sometimes shaped like Hathor herself, with her face carved carefully, as if to remind the holder that the goddess was listening. And yet, despite all this gravity, the instrument itself made a very small, jingling sound. A sound so slight, it might have been mistaken for an accident of the wind. And in this tiny sound lies its wonder, for archaeologists have found bronze and faience examples buried in tombs, placed as offerings for the journey to the afterlife, their silence as meaningful as their former voice. Even when unshaken, the sistrum carried the presence of music, a potential resting quietly in metal and memory, a lullaby waiting in stillness. Let us drift further onward. Into ancient Greece, around 2500 BC, where the aulos appeared. This instrument is no longer in use. And to modern ears, it might even sound harsh. The aulos was a double-reeded wind instrument, somewhat like two oboes joined together. Each pipe was held in either hand, and a player would blow air into both simultaneously. To control the reeds and keep steady breath, performers often wore a device called a phorboia, a leather band tied around the cheeks to prevent them from puffing out too much. The result was a sound both penetrating and insistent, ideal for festivals, religious rituals, or the theater. Unlike the soft lyre or the delicate sistrum, the aulos carried over noise, commanding attention. Yet, to play it well, one required extraordinary breath control and finger coordination, balancing two melodies or harmonies at once. To us, the thought of a player straining behind a leather strap, cheeks pressed, fingers flying, may not feel elegant. And yet in its time, the aulos was central to Greek life. Warriors marched to its rhythm, dancers moved in step, and plays unfolded with its shrill support. We may think of ancient instruments as peaceful. But the aulos reminds us that sound could also be energy, demand, and structure. Still, when placed gently in a museum case today, its pipes lie silent, mute, as if even it has grown tired, and wishes only to sleep. And if we allow ourselves a soft detour, we remember that myths, too, kept its presence alive. Marsyas, the satyr, once challenged Apollo with his aulos, only to be punished for daring to rival the god's lyre. This tale captures not only mythology but the cultural tension between instruments of discipline and those of passion, each carrying a different place in society's ear. Even the myths whisper faintly when the instrument itself has gone quiet. Soft as a slow drift of moss across a stone, the bull-roarer, around 2200 BC, unfurls its long, low story in a way that seems almost too humble to be called music, and yet it carries centuries like a secret tucked into a quiet pocket. Imagine a small, flat piece of wood, often a thin, tapered slat carved into a lozenge or rhombus shape and sometimes carefully painted, attached to a length of cord, and then swung in wide, steady circles until the air itself learns to hum, producing a low, resonant roar that carries for distances far greater than the human voice might hope to wander, a sound that in practice has been used for sacred communication, initiation rites, and the soft, authoritative calls of ritual life in many places around the world, most famously across Aboriginal Australia where the bull-roarer is woven into ceremonial practice, gendered protocols, and stories about the land. To think of it scientifically, the tone is an aerodynamic consequence of rotation, the wooden plate creating cyclic pressure variations in the surrounding air and generating predominantly low-frequency components that can travel across open country and through the hush of night, and so its effectiveness as a communication device is a matter both of material craft, the choice of wood, the width and taper of the rhombus, the length and flexibility of the cord, and of simple physics, the same physics that allows a slow octave to persist like a distant, patient bell. And now, a small, whispering aside about age, because the dates one hears for bull-roarer use can be surprisingly generous, while some modern lists gently place it in contexts like 2200 BCE for particular regional uses. Archaeological finds and ethnographic records show that world noisemakers of this family are extremely old indeed, with comparable artifacts proposed from European Upper Paleolithic sites and abroad, nearly global distribution that suggests repeated invention or cultural transmission across continents. So when we speak of the bull-roarer in Australia we speak of an instrument with a deep, storied life that may predate the particular centuries we give it in a list, the important, sleepy fact being that regardless of a precise year, it functioned as both sound and symbol, a tool to call rain in some places, to mark initiation in others, and to coax a particular, communal hush wherever it spun. Consider also the social rules around it. In many Aboriginal traditions its use is governed by clan knowledge and gendered ritual control, with handling and performance sometimes restricted to initiated men during certain ceremonies. Small, quiet cultural architectures that matter to the communities who keep these instruments, and this too is part of the instrument's subtle biography, the way an object can carry rule and reverence as easily as it carries sound. Gentle as a feather landing on still water, the long trumpet we call carnet, around 2000 BC, speaks less with melody than with a stately, ceremonial insistence. These are long, often metal tubes, bronze or later brass, that project a narrow set of pitches, their voice shaped largely by the tube's length, bore, and flaring bell, and because they produce only a few natural harmonics they have historically been useful as instruments of announcement, procession, and ceremony rather than for ornamentally complex music, serving to mark royal approach, to signal across a plain, or to accompany martial and courtly contexts where clarity and distance matter more than melodic subtlety, and in Central Asia the carnet occupies that dignified niche, long, conical or cylindrical, sometimes reaching a meter or two in length, made to be seen as much as heard, often paired with percussion in a public band and the kinds of nakara kana ensembles that rose to prominence in medieval courts but whose ancestors may be traced back through a long arc of metal trumpet use across the Near East and into South Asia. Before we continue to the small technicalities, a hushed detour about names feels appropriate because the word karna is linguistically connected to very old roots, echoes of Akkadian and Semitic terms for horn or trumpet. So when one says carnet one is speaking into a vocabulary of long, lip-controlled trumpets that stretches across languages and centuries, and that philological continuity helps explain why bronze and metal trumpets were ubiquitous in the ancient world from Mesopotamia to Egypt and later diffused into Central Asian ceremonial practices. The instrument's manufacture required metallurgical skill, casting and sometimes hammering to thin the walls and shape the bell, and its symbolic life was as important as its acoustic life, for a metal trumpet carried prestige and presence. It announced rulers, punctuated religious rites, and floated tones that could be heard above the general noise of a crowd, serving in some traditions as a kind of sonic marker of power. There is also a quiet, mechanical grace in how a player coaxes the harmonics from the tube, firm embouchure, careful, breath pressure, minor lip adjustment, small, attentive gestures that transform a static cylinder into a commanding, clarion voice, and in this way the carnet is less a lyrical companion and more a civic instrument, its austerity part of its charm for slow observation, the way a single, repeated call can become a communal punctuation in the soft arc of ceremony and ritual life across the steppes and courts where it has been cherished. Like the measured turning of a slow gear hidden beneath the velvet of a clock, the frame drum, around 1800 BC, sits quietly at the circumference of many ancient soundscapes, a shallow ring of wood over which animal skin, often goat, calf, or a similarly thin hide, is stretched and fastened by tacks, glue, or modern tensioning methods, producing a fundamental tone that is close to the body and intimate in its resonance, and though today we might casually call some of its descendants tambourines, the early Mesopotamian frame drum was usually a plain, unjingly circle used in ritual, domestic, and theatrical contexts where rhythm served as a communal heartbeat for dances, prayers, and processions. To appreciate its unassuming complexity we can turn, gently, to construction. The diameter-to-depth ratio tends to be broad and shallow, which favors a resonant, mid-range timbre and allows a human hand, palm, fingertips, or thumb, to coax varied articulations by changing contact points, speed, and pressure. And the frame itself could be carved, painted, or left bare according to the cultural preferences of a maker, a small but satisfying detail that tells us how much attention the maker paid to touch and finish, for a drum intended for ritual was as much an object of visual care as of sonic function, sometimes depicted in carvings and seals as an attribute of priestesses, musicians, or participants in sacred rites. And now, a soft aside about chronology. While a compact entry might read 1800 BCE for a Mesopotamian frame drum in a list, archaeological and iconographic records suggest frame drums appear in the ancient Near East at very early dates, and they were adapted regionally over millennia into numerous forms, from the Middle Eastern reek with jingles to the larger, deeper drums used in caravan and courtly music. So when we study an 1800 BC reference we are seeing a point in a long, continuous practice rather than an origin moment, which is important to remember because instruments evolve slowly, tacked to custom and craft, rarely born fully formed. The frame drum's social life was measured and social in kind. It accompanied civic festivals, private rites, and scenes of worship, and in certain ritual contexts it was closely associated with female religious specialists in the ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern worlds, where the sound of hand on skin could assist in trance induction, dance, or the rhythmic telling of a myth, a soft technology of communal focus rather than spectacle, and that is perhaps the drum's deepest, most comforting secret, that its sound, simple though it is, binds people into the same slow breathing of collective activity, an ancient lullaby of percussion that has quietly endured, shifting shape but not the gentle insistence of its purpose. Soft as a breath over sun-warmed stone, the Hittite horn, circa 1600 BCE, Anatolia, unfolds as a quiet, curved voice from a world of carved reliefs and careful ritual notation, and it asks nothing of us but a slow, curious listening. This is not a horn of great melodic ambition but rather an object of signal, ritual, and sculpted presence, often described in the scholarly inventories by names like the Hittite Sautra or the Luan Sautar, and it is represented in late Hittite iconography as a bull-horn shape that recalls both the natural horn of an animal and the human desire to shape that horn into something ceremonially useful, which is why some of the reliefs from places like Carchemish show a horn stylized as part of cult scenes. To say it plainly, the Hittite horn was typically limited in pitch, favored for giving signals more than for weaving melodies, and in ritual texts from Hattusa we find careful prescriptions about when instruments were to be played and who should play them, a small administrative musicology that feels oddly comforting to read because people long ago were precise about quiet things too, when a horn should sound, who may sound it, which ritual it accompanied, and so on. The material life of the instrument is a slow study in practical craft, sometimes an actual animal horn adapted for sound, other times a shaped object that took on the silhouette of a horn and was used as both libation vessel and noisemaker, carrying liquid and tone together in the same shaped receptacle, which is a little domestic miracle of function and form. The horn's voice, being largely restricted to a few natural harmonics, meant players signaled across courtyard, camp, or temple rather than composing tunes, and that practical economy of sound is part of what makes the instrument so endearingly dull and therefore perfect for our slow attention, an instrument that did not compete with language but rather punctuated it, a punctuation mark of ceremony. There is also a human side to the horn story that archaeological and textual traces allow us to touch. Hittite ritual tablets describe musical ensembles and prescribe musical behavior, and though direct instrument survival is sparse compared with neighboring Egypt or Mesopotamia, the iconography and the cuneiform notes create a careful, if fragmentary, picture of how instruments like the horn fit into social life, especially in Luwian-influenced cults where the horn's carved presence and occasional appearance on offering vessels suggests it could be both sacred implement and everyday object of pageantry. And now, a very soft aside about sound and presence, because the horn's limited tonal palette made it legible at a distance and reliable under tension, a quality prized for signaling battle, marking procession, and punctuating rites, and that beautiful modesty, its refusal to be florid, is itself a kind of dignity that has survived in the archaeological and iconographic record, a low, shaped echo of a culture that cared for the precise placement of sound in the same way it cared for the placement of a votive cup on an altar. Like the tiny shimmer of a coin beneath a slow stream, the symbol of ancient Egypt, circa 1500 BCE, glints as a pair of simple metal plates, bronze, usually, that when struck together give a bright and very immediate punctuation to rhythm, and although today we have 1,000 cymbal tones in orchestras and recording studios, those early hand cymbals were uncomplicated by design and intent. They accompanied drums, rattles, and the always important sistrum in temple processions, in festival dance, and at times in martial or public ceremonial life, where a clear, metallic click could mark the beat of orderly movement or accent a ritual phrase, and museum collections preserve examples whose smallness is part of their intimacy, such as pairs excavated from Egyptian contexts that reveal the simple anatomy of a cymbal, a slightly concave bronze plate with a central depression and, sometimes, holes or straps for handling. showing that the technology of hammered or cast metal to make a resonant plate was well understood in the Bronze Age. Linguistically and culturally, the instrument sits in a long family tree, from Greek and Latin words such as cymbalum and cymbala back to even older Central, Anatolian and Levantine practices, and its archaeological presence at sites and in shipwrecks reminds us that the same simple objects traveled with people, trade, and ritual practice across regions, occasionally appearing in burial contexts as grave goods for musicians or sacred accompanists, which quietly attests to their social value. Consider the craft for a moment, the selection of a bronze alloy, the hammering and annealing to achieve the right elasticity, the slight dome that concentrates tone, all modest, deliberate acts by hands that preferred steady work over show, and this labor produced an instrument eminently suited to its uses, compact, easy to carry, and sonically incisive in open spaces or stone-walled chambers. A small, drifting aside is appropriate here, because cymbals in Egypt were often played by women in ritual and performance contexts, their bright strikes woven into processional soundscapes with drums and sistra, and sometimes even placed in tombs as offerings for the journey beyond, where their presence was a promise of ordered sound in the afterlife. The cymbal's simple, clashing voice, at once sharp and quickly decaying, made it less an instrument of long song than a punctuation of movement and attention, and that pragmatic modesty is a restful kind of artistry, one metal plate against another, a brief spark of sound, and then silence, which is often more than enough. Gently as a warm current through a woolen shawl, the shofar, circa 1400 BCE, ancient Israel, approximate, within late Bronze to early Iron Age contexts, speaks with a curved, unadorned voice that has persisted into modern ritual life, and though the shofar's role is recorded for its most vividly in textual traditions rather than continuous material assemblages, the instrument is consistently described as a hollowed animal horn, commonly a ram's horn, used to signal, proclaim, and mark sacred time. In biblical and later rabbinic literature, the shofar appears in a variety of functions: to herald the new moon and the jubilee, to anoint kings, to assemble warriors, and to punctuate moments of communal memory, and this multiplicity of uses is mirrored by the instrument's simple acoustics, without valves or pitch-altering devices. Its range and nuance are produced by the player's embouchure and breath control, which makes the sound immediate and physically intimate, a human formed shout in horn form rather than a mechanically altered tone. The construction of a shofar is itself an unhurried craft. The horn, a keratin sheath around a bony core, is cleaned, the bone removed, and the interior smoothed and sometimes polished, leaving a natural curve that shapes the timbre and character of the blast. And because horns can be taken from various bovids, the resulting shapes and voices are delightfully irregular. Some coils give a short, bright call, others a long, solemn moan, so even within its modest design the shofar offers a variety of expression dependent on animal selection and artisanal patience. A soft aside about narrative: biblical stories place the shofar at dramatic moments, Jericho's walls, trumpet calls in camp, but the archaeological and textual record treats these tales as part of a broader cultural archive in which the horn functions as a signal, a ritual tool, and a symbol of communal cohesion, and this layered meaning explains why the shofar was regulated in halakhic discourse, with preferences for certain animals and rules about manufacturing and use, and why it survives as a living tradition in many communities. The instrument's modesty, no complex fingering, no elaborate mechanism, makes it an especially honest kind of sound tool, a direct channel from breath to air to community, and that gentle honesty, so free of pretense, is the shofar's most soothing aspect for our slow attention. A shaped horn, a practiced breath, and the soft after echo of a call that connects people across centuries, one quiet blast after another. Soft as a warm breath across a sleeping field, the Salpinx of around 1200 BC, often described in ancient texts as a straight bronze trumpet, arrives into our attention as a simple, purposeful tube whose life in Greek culture was less about melody and more about message, and so we spend a long, careful moment noticing exactly how the economy of sound works. Physically, the instrument most commonly consisted of a straight metal tube, usually bronze, somewhere in the order of about 80 to 120 centimeters in typical examples, with a flared bell sometimes finished in bone or bronze, and while modern reconstructions and the single unusually long museum specimen remind us that dimensions could vary, the essential fact is that it was a lip-vibrated aerophone whose playable pitches derive from the harmonic series of a simple cylinder, which makes it excellent for clear, distance-carrying signals rather than for nuanced melodic lines. And this is precisely why ancient authors pair it with battlefield communication, public announcements, and the measured formality of athletic contests where a single, piercing call must be heard above many other sounds. Now, a small, hushed, aside for those who like dates and slow certainty, although some lists in modern retellings sometimes place trumpet-like instruments in very early Bronze Age contexts, surviving Greek literary and archaeological evidence most reliably documents the salpinx from the early 1st millennium BCE onward, classical and archaic periods, so the neat label 1200 BCE is an understandable poetic shorthand, but it stretches somewhat beyond the secure attestations so far recovered, which is an important detail for tidy scholarship to sleep on. The instrument's manufacture required metallurgical competence, casting and sometimes soldering or connecting rings or segments, as in the unusual bone segment example in the museum collection, and players were trained to use firm embouchure and deliberate breath control to extract loud, single-line calls, meaning its performance practice sits closer to signaling technique than to the ornamental virtuosity. We imagine when we think of concert trumpeters, we also find, in quiet little mentions across inscriptions and vase paintings, that the salpinx was associated with specific civic roles, military trumpeters and public heralds, so the instrument carried social identity as well as acoustic function, and literary traces occasionally debate its origin. Some ancient writers suggested Etruscan roots, while modern organology often compares it to Egyptian trumpets, which comforts the scholar in us because cultural objects like this often have layered histories rather than simple genealogies. Think of the salpinx as a patient punctuation mark in the soundscape of an ancient polis, a straight, unadorned line drawn in air to say, attend, move, commence, which makes it an especially satisfying object to linger upon when one prefers the quiet steadiness of function to flamboyance. And in that steadiness it keeps a kind of gentle dignity that resonates into museum cases and dusty catalogs long after its last signal has faded. Gentle as the hush between two slow heartbeats, the magadis of around 1000 BCE slips into view as a somewhat elusive stringed presence in archaic Greek literature, and because ancient writers themselves argued quietly about what the word meant, we must speak with a soft, careful voice. Literary sources such as Athenaeus in fragments cited from Posidonius and Aristoxenus suggest that the magadis was regarded by many authors as a plucked, multi-stringed instrument, often likened to harps, psalteries, or similar zithers, rather than a woodwind, and some passages even hint at a surprisingly large number of strings, one early testimony reports. Instruments with many strings, and later commentators link the magadis with the pectes, so while modern scholarship still debates exact organology, the prevailing scholarly tendency treats the magadis as a type of harp or psaltery used in archaic and classical Greek musical contexts. A small, soft detour about origin and usage is in order. A number of ancient commentators attribute the instrument's origin to Lydia or to non-Greek neighbors, which would fit a wider pattern of string instrument diffusion from Anatolia into the Aegean, and this external association is echoed by the linguistic suggestions that the name itself may be of Lydian or otherwise non-Greek provenance. Tiny etymological footprints that scholars follow with quiet patience. In practice, the magadis seems to have been connected with certain social uses. Some writers associate it with dancing, with female performers, or with lyrical accompaniment, so rather than being a showy solo vehicle it often appears as a part of domestic and ceremonial soundscapes in the literary imagination, a companion for song, recitation, and collective leisure. Now, a small, hushed aside about the long temporal arc. References to the magadis appear in archaic and classical sources, centuries that comfortably sit within the 1st millennium BCE, and by Roman times the direct references thin out or the instrument's name changes as new instruments and terminology circulate across the region, which is why it is fair to say the magadis had faded from common mention by the Roman era even if stringed Plucked instruments of the same family continue to exist in various forms. Technically, assumptions about its construction, multiple strings of gut or sinew stretched across a frame, possibly plucked with fingers or plectra, and tuned to Old Greek genera and tetrachordal frameworks, are reconstructed from comparative description rather than surviving complete artifacts, which means each confident-sounding sentence in this paragraph is actually a careful stitching together of literary testimony, comparative organology, and a small pile of vase or relief imagery. In short, the magadis, the kind of instrument lovers of soft detail adore because it resists a tidy, loud biography and instead offers a hushed, fragmentary one, an instrument that invites us to imagine the fingers that once drew gentle arpeggios across many strings late into quiet evenings in the Aegean, the sound folded into conversation, dance, and the slow passage of ritual time. Tender as the gentle coiling of a vine, the pandura of around 900 BC, often called a trichordon when it bore 3 strings, takes its place among long-necked lutes that quietly shaped the stringed instrument family across the Mediterranean and Near East, and so we trace its lineage with a soft, attentive hand. Organologically, the pandura is typically described as a medium to long-necked lute with a small, shallow soundbox and commonly 3 strings in its classical Greek iterations, plucked or strummed and often fretted with movable leather or cord frets in some regional practices, which made it adaptable to the ancient Greek genera and modes by allowing subtle changes in string length and thus pitch. And because lutes of this type have roots in earlier Mesopotamian and Anatolian long-necked instruments, where archaeological and iconographic traces reach back into the 3rd millennium BC, the pandura sits within a long, slow web of instrument evolution rather than appearing suddenly. Now, a soft sidestep about visual evidence, the instrument is depicted in Greek art from the 1st millennium BCE onward, with particularly useful images in bas-reliefs, such as panels preserved in museum collections, showing lyre and lute family instruments in the hands of muses and performers, and the Mantinea sculptural group and later Hellenistic depictions give us securely datable iconography that places a pandura-type instrument firmly in the visual record by the classical period, even as similar lute forms continue to be made and adapted through Roman and Byzantine times. Constructionally, the pandura's small resonator and long neck make it a compact instrument ideal for personal accompaniment, shepherd song, and itinerant musicianship, and its modest voice, intimate rather than stadium-filling, made it perfect for narrative singing, dance accompaniment, and the accompaniment of song. In domestic contexts, which accounts for its persistence and its transformation into regional descendants like the tambouras, saws, and the Georgian panduri, another delicate aside about chronology, while some lists supply round early dates such as 900 BCE to indicate the instrument family's early development, the clearest Greek artistic and textual attestations cluster in the later 1st millennium BC, classical and Hellenistic centuries, and comparisons with Near Eastern lutes underline the pandura's deep ancestral threads rather than a single, neat invention date, which is a comforting thought for those who prefer gradual, evolutionary stories. Ultimately, the pandura's charm lies in its restrained endurance, 3 strings, a patient neck, fingers learning to press and release, and a lineage that unfurls across centuries like a slow melody, a perfectly suitable subject for our soft, pedantic contemplation. Soft as drifting mist across a sun-warmed grove, the hydraulis of around 800 BCE whispers its way into the quiet corners of imagination, and we find ourselves attending to an instrument that is both clever and patient, a curious machine of ancient ingenuity. The hydraulis, often considered the earliest known pipe organ, relied upon a combination of air pressure and water to maintain a steady tone, a technology that feels astonishingly deliberate in its simplicity and yet is exquisitely subtle in practice. Its pipes, often made of bronze or reeds, were organized in ranks, each one producing a different pitch, and the flow of air was regulated through a mechanism of keys, sliders, and valves, with water in a reservoir ensuring a constant pressure, which in turn allowed the pipes to sound continuously without the faltering breath of a human player. One might imagine a craftsman in a quiet workshop, adjusting delicate valves, pouring water with care, testing the pitch by listening with the softest ear, until the instrument sang evenly across its limited range. The invention is attributed to Ctesibius of Alexandria, a mathematician and engineer who lived in the 3rd century BCE, though textual references suggest earlier prototypes existed in Greek contexts. These early hydraulic instruments were often played in public gatherings, amphitheaters, or private banquets, producing a sound that is described as clear, soft, and capable of filling large halls, yet without the abrasive harshness of later reed organs. A slow little detour into technical detail reveals that the hydraulic water mechanism served to stabilize pressure. As air is forced into a wind chamber by bellows, the water column ensures that fluctuations are smoothed, allowing pipes to produce a steady pitch, which is something modern organists and builders admire as both ingenious and beautifully practical. Archaeological remains, such as the fragments discovered in Dion, Greece, give us measurements, layouts, and even the impression that ancient builders were attentive to tonal consistency, scaling pipe length and diameter carefully. Small images on Greek vases also depict musicians operating these early organs with hands on keys while assistants might manage the water flow, showing a subtle choreography between human, machine, and natural principle. The instrument's presence reminds us that ancient Greeks, often celebrated for philosophy and sculpture, were also meticulous about sonic mechanics, a gentle obsession with controlled sound, regulated by both physics and patient observation. It is easy to imagine that the soft hiss of water, the gentle press of keys, and the quiet resonance of pipes could create a hypnotic soundscape, one perfectly suited for contemplation, ceremonial pauses, or even meditation. This attention to technical detail, combined with the soft musical result, makes the hydraulis a remarkable, almost meditative, object, a precise balance of air, water, and bronze, a testament to early engineering wrapped in quiet, auditory beauty, and a reminder that the ancients approached invention with both care and the poetic sense of possibility. Gentle as a feather falling through the drowsy air, the Nabla harp of around 700 BCE appears in our musings as a triangular, angular frame whose quiet presence is marked by strings stretched across its apex and base, producing soft, delicate tones that were likely intimate in volume yet resonant in social significance. This harp, known from iconography and textual hints in ancient Israelite contexts, is characterized by its angular shape, with a resonating soundbox, typically wooden, supporting a set of gut or sinew strings that could number anywhere from 6 to 12 or more, depending on the maker, the tuning, presumably diatonic or based on local modal systems, required a careful, patient ear, and one imagines musicians sitting with the instrument on the lap, plucking each string slowly, feeling the gentle vibration travel through the wood and into their fingertips. The angular harp's decline by medieval times does not diminish its quiet sophistication, rather, it invites contemplation of an instrument that existed in the interstices of daily life, ritual performance, and ceremonial accompaniment, offering sound that was modest, precise, and always attentive to the human scale. Some depictions suggest that the Nabla harp accompanied singing or recitation, where the plucked tones marked pauses, emphasized words, or mirrored natural rhythms, such as the lapping of water or the sigh of wind, creating an acoustic metaphor for the natural world. Construction required patience, selecting the right wood, carving a triangular frame, stretching strings with careful attention to tension and elasticity, and adjusting small bridges to control pitch subtly, all tasks that rewarded steady hands and slow observation. The harp's social context is no less deliberate. References and textual sources indicate that harpists often performed in courts, religious settings, and intimate gatherings, providing a quiet backdrop for reflection, narrative, or devotion, rather than drawing attention to themselves. It is fascinating, softly so, to note that by the time larger medieval harps appear in Europe, the angular Nabla form had largely disappeared, leaving only its gentle echoes in iconography and faint textual mentions. Its obsolescence, paradoxically, allows the mind to linger on it without pressure, appreciating the slow mathematics of string tension, resonance, and the almost invisible artistry of an instrument that asks little of its audience beyond attention and patience. Softly, as the wind curves around the edges of a quiet hill, the Etruscan liturgus of around 600 BCE comes into focus as a long, J-shaped trumpet whose life was inseparable from ritual and ceremony in ancient Italy. The liturgus, crafted from bronze or sometimes other metals, typically measured over a meter in length, its body curved in an elegant arc that allowed the player to project sound over distance while maintaining control of breath and embouchure. Its use in Etruscan society was primarily ceremonial. It signaled the start of rituals, accompanied religious processions, and was often depicted in iconography alongside priests, augurs, and sacrificial rites, marking both time and spiritual attention. The horn's construction demanded careful shaping of metal, precise joining of sections, and a smooth interior bore to maximize tonal clarity, which meant artisans worked slowly, observing both the principles of acoustics and the aesthetic requirements of ceremonial grandeur. A soft pause for historical context reminds us that while similar straight or curved trumpets appear in neighboring Greek and Italic cultures, the liturgus was distinctive in its consistent curvature and symbolic association, sometimes interpreted as an extension of Etruscan cosmology, where sound itself was a medium of communication with divine forces. Its tone, bright and commanding yet restrained by the length and bore, made it audible across the spatial expanse of a ritual site, marking rhythm, signaling transitions, and orchestrating human movement in harmony with sacred observances. Archaeological and artistic evidence, including tomb paintings and bronze replicas, indicate that performers held the liturgus vertically or at a slight angle, lips pressed firmly to the mouthpiece, fingers absent from pitch control, relying solely on breath and embouchure, which highlights the physical intimacy between player and instrument. This J-shaped trumpet, though not complex in melodic capability, embodies an extraordinary subtlety in social and ceremonial function, a marriage of acoustic principle, ritual expectation, and material craftsmanship that continues to whisper across centuries to those willing to listen quietly and attentively. Soft as a morning mist curling over a quiet bamboo grove, the Cheng of around 500 BCE unfolds gently into our contemplation, an instrument whose presence in early China is both technically ingenious and serenely meditative. This mouth organ, made of a series of vertical bamboo pipes of varying lengths inserted into a small wind chest, represents a remarkable precursor to both the harmonica and the pipe organ, and its careful design allowed the player to sound multiple pipes simultaneously, producing chords or simple melodic patterns. Each pipe contained a free reed, often of thin metal, which would vibrate when air was blown or drawn through the pipe, a principle that demanded both patience and precision from the builder and the performer alike. Imagining the crafting process invites a quiet delight, selecting bamboo stalks with the right diameter, cutting them to precise lengths, drilling holes with meticulous care, inserting reeds fashioned from thin bronze or brass, and sealing the base in such a way as to prevent air leakage, all tasks requiring deliberate hands, calm attention, and repeated adjustments. A slow little detour for those who appreciate chronology, while surviving textual references place the Cheng in the 5th century BC. Archaeological fragments and later depictions suggest its origins may extend slightly earlier, showing a careful evolution of mouth organ technology over centuries in ancient China. Performance practice involved not only finger placement to cover holes at the top of the pipes but also breath control to sustain harmony across multiple tones, which made the instrument suitable for solo meditative music, court ceremonies, or small ensemble contexts where subtlety and tonal clarity were valued above loudness. The Cheng's social role is quietly fascinating. It was often played in ritual, offering a bridge between earthly practice and celestial symbolism, and its layered chords could accompany song, poetry, or dance in a measured, contemplative manner. Even the act of tuning the Cheng required hours of patient testing, as each bamboo pipe and reed combination responded differently to humidity, temperature, and age, a delicate interplay of material, environment, and human touch that seems almost impossible in our modern hurry. In this way, the cheng is less an instrument and more a gentle conversation between maker, player, and natural world, where every breath produces a soft, floating sound, and every note seems suspended, like mist in the air, waiting for the mind to notice its quiet presence. Gentle as the lap of waves over a coral shore, the sambuela horn of around 400 BCE drifts into our attention, a shell trumpet from the Pacific Islands whose curved, spiral form harnessed natural acoustics to carry sound across water and dense vegetation. This instrument, constructed from large conch shells or similarly resonant mollusks, was hollowed and sometimes augmented with small plugs or mouthpieces, allowing a single strong tone to emerge when blown with carefully modulated breath. The sambuela horn was employed for ritual purposes, marking significant communal events, as well as for practical signaling during navigation and long-distance communication between islands, a practice that is now largely obsolete due to modern signaling technologies. Imagining its use, one can picture a slow procession along a palm-lined coast, the horn sound resonating across waves and forested hills, delivering a message that required patience to interpret, and a communal attentiveness to respond. A soft pause for constructional insight, shaping the mouthpiece to the player's lips, smoothing the shell's interior, and maintaining the natural curvature for optimal resonance required deliberate work over hours, often guided by tradition and careful listening to the shell's natural voice. Its disappearance is not merely technological but cultural, as metal and bamboo trumpets, drums, and modern signaling devices became more common. The delicate, ethereal sound of the sambuela horn faded from daily life, surviving only in ceremonial or historical references. We might also linger on the horn's acoustic principle. The pitch depends on the shell's internal volume and the force of air applied, meaning each horn had a slightly unique tone, and performers needed careful control to produce steady calls. The instrument's social role was nuanced. In ritual, it acted as a bridge between community members, signaling gathering, warning, or celebration. In navigation, it provided auditory guidance where visual markers were absent, creating a soft dialogue between human and environment that is rarely found in modern instruments. In this way, the sambuela horn exists in memory as a quiet, organic technology, shaped by nature and human ingenuity, a resonant artifact whose sound once carried across ocean and forest, and which now drifts through imagination with a gentle, lingering presence. Soft as the tremble of a leaf in the drowsy afternoon sun, the kithara of around 300 BCE rises into view, a professional 7-string lyre of ancient Greece, distinguished by its structural refinement, artistic significance, and role in the hands of trained musicians. Unlike simpler lyres, the kithara required meticulous craftsmanship, a deep, resonant soundbox carved from a single piece of wood or carefully joined planks, arms rising gracefully to hold strings made of twisted animal gut, and tuning pegs designed for precise adjustment to achieve consonant intervals. It was an instrument of professional and ceremonial use, frequently accompanying poetry, singing, and public performance in contexts ranging from contests of skill to religious festivals, where both tonal quality and visual elegance were valued. A slow little detour for those who delight in physical detail, surviving depictions on vases, reliefs, and literary description indicate that the kithara's arms were often curved outward, a subtle design choice that allowed even tension across strings, and that its soundbox resonated with depth, amplifying the gut strings without metallic reinforcement. Players, trained over many years, manipulated the strings with delicate fingers, plucking in careful sequences to support song or rhythm, their hands a study in controlled patience, and sometimes using small finger guards or plectra to achieve clarity without damaging the instrument. The kithara was also a social marker. Only skilled performers, sometimes professional musicians, were permitted to play it in public or religious settings, marking a distinction between informal musical expression and cultivated artistry. This layered combination of technical sophistication, acoustic subtlety, and social prestige allows us to imagine the instrument not merely as a source of sound but as a carefully choreographed presence in Greek culture, an object that combined patience, artistry, and ceremonial function. Its 7 strings, resonant yet intimate, vibrated slowly through the air, accompanying voices and gestures in a musical dialogue that was both formal and quietly expressive, a soundscape of human skill intertwined with cultural expectation, perfectly suited for a slow, reflective meditation on ancient life. Soft as the subtle ripple of a quiet river under morning mist, the Roman cornu of around 200 BCE drifts gently into view, a large, curved brass instrument whose presence in military and ceremonial life is both commanding and carefully measured. Constructed from sheets of bronze bent into a long, gently spiraling curve, often about 3 meters in total length, the cornu produced a loud, penetrating tone designed to carry across the din of Roman camps and battlefields, yet the effort to build and play it required patient, meticulous attention. Artisans had to anneal the metal carefully, join sections seamlessly with rivets or solder, and fashion a mouthpiece that allowed a single player to generate consistent vibration, which demanded steady breath control and firm embouchure. A slow little detour for technical contemplation, the curvature of the cornu was not merely aesthetic, but functionally important, allowing the long tube to fit comfortably on the player's shoulder and across the body while preserving acoustic efficiency, and the instrument's design ensured that the sound could project in a coherent, far-reaching call, much like a human voice amplified by a gentle, metallic megaphone. In Roman military contexts, cornicines, or horn players, were trained to execute precise signals for marching, tactical maneuvers, and ceremonial occasions, their fingers largely absent from pitch modulation, as sound production relied almost entirely on lip tension, breath pressure, and subtle hand adjustments to influence tone. The cornu's social and ceremonial presence extended beyond mere battlefield communication. It also appeared in public games, triumphal processions, and religious events, serving as a marker of civic authority and solemnity. Imagining the instrument in operation, one can picture a line of soldiers standing quietly while a single cornicine raises the instrument, producing a long, rolling tone that echoes across hills and campgrounds, each call coordinated, rehearsed, and understood by a listening community attuned to the nuances of volume, duration, and cadence. Even the act of transporting and maintaining a cornu demanded care. The metal had to be polished to prevent corrosion, dents had to be repaired without altering bore dimensions, and the mouthpiece adjusted delicately to suit each player's embouchure and breath capacity. This combination of physical effort, acoustic principle, and social choreography renders the cornu a quiet marvel of engineering and disciplined artistry, whose sound, though loud, emerges from a profound, patient collaboration between human, material, and environment. Gentle as a drifting autumn leaf settling on soft earth, the Roman tuba of around 100 BCE appears, a straight bronze trumpet whose simplicity is deceptive and whose role in Roman culture was as precise as it was functional. Unlike the modern tuba, the Roman tuba was a long, straight aerophone, typically over a meter in length, with a narrow bore and flared bell, designed to emit a clear, bright tone that could carry over crowds or across military formations. Cracking the tuba demanded precise bronze work, hammering and soldering to achieve a uniform internal diameter, and the mouthpiece had to be carefully shaped to optimize embouchure, breath, and resonance. Small imperfections could distort the sound, and therefore each instrument represented hours of meticulous labor. A soft pause for historical context. Literary and epigraphic sources indicate that the tuba was used extensively in military signals, civic ceremonies, and religious rituals, and its sound, though simple in pitch, is described as commanding attention and conveying authority, a sonic symbol of Roman organization and discipline. In practice, performers, often soldiers trained in precise timing, would hold the tuba vertically or slightly inclined, blowing sustained, resonant tones without vowels or fingered pitch changes, relying entirely on the physics of lip vibration to produce the notes required for signaling. Iconography, such as reliefs on triumphal arches and tombstones, shows players with these straight instruments as an integral part of ensemble performance, often paired with drums, cornu, or other signal instruments, creating a carefully balanced auditory landscape for communication and ceremony. Another soft detour for acoustical reflection, the tuba's long, narrow tube produces a timbre that is bright yet stable, capable of carrying over open spaces, and its design represents a combination of practical military need and the Roman taste for visual symmetry, as the straight line of the instrument mirrored the order and discipline of the formations it accompanied. Maintenance, too, was exacting. Bronze corrosion had to be checked, the mouthpiece shaped repeatedly to fit individual embouchures, and care taken to avoid denting the straight, delicate tube. In this way, the Roman tuba embodies a union of engineering, acoustics, and social function, a tool for communication, a symbol of discipline, and an object of quiet technical elegance. Soft as the gentle thrum of a summer breeze over a calm hillside, the tympanon of around 50 BCE floats into our attention, a hand drum from ancient Greece whose stretched animal skin and circular frame mark it as an ancestor of the tambourine. Its body, typically a shallow wooden frame, supported a drumhead of carefully prepared animal hide, stretched tight and secured with glue, cords, or tacks, demanding considerable patience to achieve even tension for consistent tone. Players would hold the instrument with one hand, often plucking, striking, or shaking it with the other, creating rhythmic patterns that accompanied dance, song, or ritual chant. The sound was intimate, subtle, and immediate, not designed to carry across large distances but to interact closely with performers and audience alike. A small, quiet detour. Some depictions on vase paintings suggest that tympana could be decorated with painted motifs, possibly indicating ownership, regional style, or ceremonial context, and the skins may have been occasionally oiled or treated to adjust tension and timbre, adding another layer of delicate craftsmanship. Its social and cultural role was substantial. In religious ceremonies, the tympanon provided a rhythm that guided movement, synchronized collective participation, or marked transitions in ritual, while in domestic or entertainment contexts it enhanced storytelling, song, or dance, emphasizing temporal structure and aesthetic continuity. Constructionally, the process required selecting the right wood, shaping it into a smooth, circular frame, preparing hide with patience and attention to thickness and elasticity, and tuning the head to achieve the desired response. Every small adjustment could alter the subtle tonal quality and resonance. The tympanon's presence reminds us that rhythm, even in a simple hand drum, was a deliberate, cultivated feature of Greek musical practice, a soft pulse underlying more complex forms of expression, an instrument whose quiet sophistication rewards the attentive mind. Imagining the player striking the stretched skin, feeling its tension and responding to its slight bounce, one appreciates the intimacy of human contact with material, and how these gentle vibrations could structure communal sound, ceremony, and play. The tympanon thus occupies a quiet, enduring space in the history of percussion, a simple yet refined precursor to many instruments that would later carry rhythm across centuries, resonating softly in memory, imagination, and attentive contemplation. Softly, as the last gentle echo of the tympanon drifts into stillness, we might allow our minds to linger on the delicate interplay of hand, hide, and air. The quiet vibrations taper off, leaving a space where thought and imagination mingle like light dust motes in a sunbeam, and the rhythm of history seems to pause, just for us. In this moment, the past and present fold gently together, and we can drift slowly, comfortably, toward a calm awareness, letting the memory of sound settle like a soft feather on the mind. If your eyes are closed, if your thoughts are drifting, then my job here is done for today. Thank you for spending this unremarkable moment with me. You have listened to The Sleepy Sloth, where uninteresting things become the softest lullabies.